For veteran Ethan Ward, the mountains of Shadow Ridge were meant to be his final refuge, a silence to bury the echoes of war. But one dusk, his German shepherd Bruno froze at the mouth of a forgotten canyon. The wind carried a metallic echo, not of silver, but of something older, sealed in stone, waiting for the wrong hands to claim it. Ethan didn't know that stepping through that rusted gate would awaken a secret hidden since the war, and a battle for truth that could cost him everything. Please support us by subscribing, comment where you're watching from, and share to keep their story alive. Ethan Ward had not come to the mountains of Colorado in search of beauty, though there was plenty of it. He had come here for silence, for the kind of stillness that could cradle a man whose memories would not stop screaming. Years of combat had carved him into something sharp and wary, a figure cut from discipline and exhaustion, and though the war was long behind him, its dust and fire still clung to his mind. At 40, his hair already showed streaks of gray, his face worn by sun and hardship, and his body carried the posture of someone who had never fully left the battlefield. The log cabin he kept near Shadow Ridge was plain and functional, built with his own hands, and furnished with only what was necessary: a cot, a stove, a shelf of old paperbacks, and a coat rack where his worn flannel always hung. His closest companion, perhaps his only one, was Bruno. The German shepherd was black as midnight, with a broad chest and intelligent amber eyes that seemed to read the world before Ethan even noticed it. 7 years old, disciplined as a soldier, Bruno was the steady heartbeat of Ethan's exile. The dog's presence was a living tether, pulling him back from the edge when memory threatened to drag him under. Bruno had been trained once, sharp and precise, but here he was allowed to be both guardian and friend. The days followed a rhythm as predictable as the sun's path over the ridge. Ethan rose before dawn, brewed black coffee in a battered percolator, and shared half a slice of toast with Bruno, who waited patiently for his portion as if it were a ritual of loyalty. Breakfast was followed by a walk along the dirt trails that cut through stands of pine, the dog ranging ahead but never straying far. Ethan spoke little, even to Bruno, but there was comfort in the dog's quiet companionship, the sound of paws against earth, the occasional tilt of ears at an unseen bird. Town was avoided whenever possible. The people there knew his name and whispered the word veteran, as though it explained everything. But Ethan wanted neither pity nor curiosity. His supplies were simple: canned food, coffee, dried meat for Bruno, and his life was a fortress against human noise. In the evenings, when the light bled gold across the cliffs, he would patrol the edge of Shadow Ridge Canyon. Old habits died hardest, scanning ridge lines, noting tracks in the dirt, always alert. Bruno padded beside him, head high, tail steady, as if sharing the same invisible mission. It was during one such patrol that the silence broke. At first it was faint, so faint Ethan thought it a trick of memory. A metallic clang, hollow and distant, swallowed quickly by the wind. He froze, eyes narrowing, ears straining. Bruno had already heard it. The shepherd's body went stiff, muscles tight, ears pricked toward the dark cut of the canyon. A low rumble grew in his throat, not aggression but unease, the kind of sound a soldier makes when something feels wrong but cannot yet be seen. Ethan crouched, one hand brushing the coarse fur at Bruno's neck. "Easy," he muttered, though the words were for himself as much as for the dog. He waited. The mountain should have been quiet, just the whisper of pines and the scrape of loose rock shifting with the cooling air. Yet again it came, clearer this time, a ring of iron striking stone echoing through the chasm as if from far underground. The veteran's chest tightened. He knew echoes. He knew how sound carried, how sometimes it bent truth, made things seem nearer or farther. But this was deliberate. It was the sound of metal meeting metal, not nature, not accident. His mind told him to dismiss it, just a loose chain left by miners long dead, or some hunter's tool dropped in the rocks. But Bruno's eyes told another story. The shepherd stood rigid, tail lowered, gaze locked on the black mouth of the canyon as if something inside it breathed. Ethan rose slowly, the air heavy against his skin, his instincts pulling him in two directions, one that craved to turn away and return to the cabin, lock the door, keep the silence, the other that recognized the familiar thrum of unease, the feeling before contact, before ambush. He inhaled, tasted the metallic tang of the air, and for a moment he was back overseas, listening for the faint scrape that meant a trap had been set. He closed his eyes and shook the thought away. That was supposed to be over. "Not tonight," he whispered, tugging gently at Bruno's collar. The dog obeyed, but reluctantly, glancing back toward the canyon even as they returned to the trail. Ethan tried to steady himself with the crunch of gravel beneath his boots, the rhythm of Bruno's steps beside him. Yet his heartbeat betrayed him. Faster. Sharper. The silence of the ridge no longer felt like comfort, but like the pause before something inevitable. Back at the cabin, Ethan sat before the embers in his hearth, his hands restless. Bruno lay at his feet, but kept his ears trained toward the canyon as if waiting for the sound again. Ethan stared at the shadows flickering against the wooden walls, his jaw tight. He had built this life on silence, on the promise that the past could be locked away. But now, for the first time in years, silence itself felt fragile. The metallic echo lingered in his mind long after the night settled in. He could not push it away, not even as fatigue pressed against his eyes. Bruno shifted, exhaled softly, but his gaze still pointed towards the window and the dark ridgeline beyond. Ethan whispered to himself, to the dog, to the ghosts in the stone. The mountain wasn't empty, it was speaking. The morning after the echo, Ethan forced himself back into routine. He brewed coffee strong enough to sting the back of his throat, dropped half a piece of toast onto the plate at his feet, and watched Bruno devour it with measured calm. Outside the cabin, the mountains wore a hard winter blue sky, the kind that looked endless but carried a bite of frost in the air. He tried to convince himself last night had been nothing, a trick of stone, a dog's imagination, but the unease stayed with him, heavy as the pack he used to carry in foreign deserts. It was Bruno who broke the pattern that day. On their way down the winding dirt road toward the small town of Silverton, the shepherd pulled insistently at the leash, urging him faster. Ethan had planned only to check the post office, pick up dry goods, return without a word to anyone. He hated errands. Town meant questions, eyes lingering on his limp, the polite but hollow conversations that left him exhausted. Still, Bruno tugged until Ethan muttered, all right, and lengthened his stride. The post office was a squat brick building tucked between the diner and the hardware store. Inside, dust floated lazily through a shaft of light, and Mrs. Keating, the postmistress, lifted her head with a faint smile. "Morning, Mr. Ward. Got something for you today. Looks important." She slid a cream-colored envelope across the counter. Ethan frowned. His mail was usually junk flyers or bills for propane. The envelope was crisp, its edges sharp, the return address embossed in black. Davies and Associates, Burlington, Vermont. A law firm. He hadn't dealt with lawyers since signing his discharge papers. He turned it over in his hands, uneasy. Bruno sat beside him, amber eyes fixed on the envelope, tail twitching once against the floorboards. Ethan felt the dog's focus as if it were a weight pressing into his palm. He muttered, Don't look at me like that." But Bruno lifted a paw and tapped the envelope lightly, almost deliberate, almost insistent. Back in the truck, Ethan slit the seal with his pocket knife. The paper inside was brief and formal. He read it once quickly, then again slowly, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something else. To Mr. Ethan Ward. "We regret to inform you of the passing of your uncle, Samuel Ward, of Burlington, Vermont. In accordance with his last will and testament, you have been named the sole heir to the property known as Shadow Ridge Silver Mine, located in San Juan County, Colorado." Ethan blinked at the name, disbelieving. Shadow Ridge, the canyon that had spoken last night. He leaned back in the worn seat, the letter crumpling slightly in his fist. His Uncle Samuel had been a distant figure, half forgotten. Ethan remembered meeting him perhaps twice as a boy, an academic type, soft-spoken, with the smell of tobacco and books clinging to his jacket. Samuel had seemed an odd branch on the Ward family tree, a man who kept to himself, who never joined the rowdy reunions filled with beer and loud voices. And now, after all these years, the man had left him an entire mine. Ethan's gut twisted. He hadn't asked for this. He didn't want land, deeds, or obligations. He wanted silence. His cabin was enough. More than enough. A mine meant history, debts, the interest of people like Gregory Harlow, the kind of entanglements that shredded peace into ribbons. Bruno shifted, pressing his head against Ethan's arm, eyes steady, questioning. Ethan sighed and let the letter fall into his lap. "It's nothing," he told the dog. "Just words on paper." Yet his voice lacked conviction. On the drive back, he couldn't stop glancing at the folded letter. Each time he pushed it away, Bruno nosed it back into his lap, as though reminding him. Finally, Ethan parked at the edge of the ridge, killed the engine, and stared out at the jagged horizon. The wind carried the scent of pine and iron, sharp and raw. "What am I supposed to do with a mine?" he muttered. Sell it, he thought. Call the lawyer, sign whatever documents needed signing, and let it pass to someone else. Easy, clean. He could take the check, never see the place, never think about it again. He could go back to his cabin, his coffee, his walks. But another part of him resisted. He pictured last night's echo, the hollow clang that had rippled through the canyon walls. He pictured Bruno's stiff posture, the certainty in the dog's eyes. He pictured Uncle Samuel, quiet and kind, leaving this place not to the louder cousins but to him. Why? He imagined leaving it unexamined, closing the door before it opened. Would that be betrayal? Or mercy? The debate raged silently as the sky darkened, streaks of orange cutting across the cliffs. Bruno pawed the letter again, softly, but the gesture carried weight. Ethan felt the familiar stir in his chest, the pull of duty, the echo of orders once barked and obeyed. He had sworn off missions. He had sworn off battles. But some things could not be ignored. He crumpled the letter tighter, then smoothed it flat again across the steering wheel. His reflection in the glass was weary, but behind the weariness something steadier flickered, something that had not been extinguished by war. He spoke aloud, to Bruno, to himself, to the ghost of his uncle. One last mission. See it, then walk away. Bruno barked once, sharp and certain, as if sealing the vow. The morning came with a pale light stretched thin across the mountains, the kind of light that carried no warmth, only the reminder that autumn was sliding toward winter. Ethan stood by his truck, the letter folded in the breast pocket of his flannel, Bruno waiting at his side with the calm readiness of a soldier before a march. He had slept poorly, the echo of the canyon weaving through his dreams, his uncle's name haunting him in ways he had not expected. The decision had been made, though. One last mission. See the place, then walk away. He told himself it was simple reconnaissance, a task defined and limited. Nothing more. The truck groaned as it climbed the switchbacks into the high country. Gravel rattled beneath the tires, and the engine's low rumble mixed with the sigh of the wind threading through endless stands of pine. Bruno leaned into the open window, ears slicing the air, his nose twitching at scents carried down from ridges painted with fire-orange aspens and the darker green of spruce. To Ethan's right, the cliffs rose in jagged red walls, scarred and rusted as though the earth itself bore the memory of pickaxes and dynamite. To the left, the drop fell away into valleys where rivers flashed like silver blades between the trees. Ethan kept his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes scanning the bends ahead, the way he always had when convoys rolled into hostile ground. Old instincts never really left. They only slept. The road narrowed as it climbed, broken patches where rock slides had torn away asphalt long ago. A weather-beaten sign leaned sideways at the fork, its letters faded but still legible. Shadow Ridge Mining Co. The arrow pointed up a rutted track nearly swallowed by weeds and fallen branches. Ethan shifted gears, coaxing the truck onto the path, the suspension groaning under the strain. Bruno braced himself, paws planted firm on the seat, gaze fixed forward as if he too knew this was more than a drive. After another half-mile, the trees opened into a clearing where the mine waited like a wound in the mountain. The first thing Ethan saw was the gate. 2 iron doors hinged on stone pillars, their bars eaten by rust, chained together but sagging as if ready to collapse with a touch. Beside them a wooden sign lay half-buried in grass, the words Shadow Ridge carved in bold letters but bleached gray by decades of storms. Beyond the gate yawned the mouth of the mine, a black shaft cut into the rock, its edges jagged, its darkness absolute. Ethan killed the engine. Silence fell heavy, the kind of silence that pressed against the skin, thicker than the forest's usual hush. Even the wind seemed to hesitate here, as though the air itself was reluctant to move too close. Bruno leapt from the truck before Ethan could stop him, landing light on the mossy ground. The shepherd's ears shot forward, body tense, tail stiff. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he stared into the shaft, his hackles lifting like dark bristles. Ethan joined him at the gate, fingers brushing the cold iron. The smell of rust and damp stone hung in the air, sharp and old. He let his gaze adjust to the shadows inside. Nothing moved. Yet Bruno's growl deepened, vibrating low and steady, not fear, but warning. Ethan had learned long ago to trust that sound more than his own senses. Kneeling, he studied the ground. The weeds near the track were flattened, not by deer or elk, but by tires, deep impressions with treads too clean to be decades old. SUV, heavy, probably within the last week. He moved further, eyes narrowing. Near the edge of the shaft, where the earth turned to gravel, boot prints broke the surface, large, sharp-edged, one step overlapping another as though men had waited there. Beside a stone, half hidden in weeds, a cigarette butt gleamed white and orange, the filter barely stained. He picked it up with 2 fingers, turning it in the pale light. Fresh. A muscle ticked in Ethan's jaw. Someone had been here, maybe still was. He scanned the tree line automatically, every shift of branch and shadow suddenly suspect. The canyon echoed again in his mind, the metallic clang like a ghostly reminder. The inheritance was no forgotten relic. Others already hunted it. He slipped the cigarette into his pocket, not as evidence for anyone else, but as proof for himself. Bruno circled near the gate, nose low to the ground, tail rigid. His growl tapered into sharp breaths, the dog's body language screaming unease. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying both of them. The silence of the clearing was no longer empty. It was crowded, with the weight of footsteps that had passed before him, with the threat of eyes that might still be watching, with a history that had not stayed buried. Ethan felt the mountain shift inside him, as though the ridge itself had closed the door on retreat. He had wanted a simple look, a quick end to obligation, but the evidence on the ground told another story. There would be no easy exit. He straightened, staring into the blackness of the shaft, the rusted gate between him and whatever secrets the mountain chose to guard. Bruno leaned forward, ears stiff, eyes locked. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath misting in the cold air, and admitted what he already knew. He was not alone out here. Someone else was already hunting. The bell above the diner door jingled with a tired chime as Ethan stepped inside, the warmth of coffee and frying bacon wrapping around him like an old blanket. The place was nearly empty, just a pair of locals hunched over the counter and a waitress in a faded apron topping off mugs. Bruno settled obediently at his heel, a silent shadow, though his ears twitched as though he too felt the weight of unseen eyes. Ethan had only meant to grab coffee, something hot to chase away the cold silence of the mine still clinging to him. But the moment he slid into a booth by the window, he realized he wasn't alone in his errand. Across the room, dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed absurdly out of place in this mountain town, sat a man who looked as though he had stepped out of a boardroom. The stranger's hair was swept back with careful precision, silver streaks blending into a dark wave that gleamed beneath the diner's weak lights. He was broad-shouldered but soft in the way of men who had never worked a day with their hands. And when his gray eyes rose to meet Ethan's across the room, the corners of his mouth curved into a practiced, effortless smile. He stood, leaving behind a leather briefcase that looked newer than anything else in the room, and approached with the unhurried confidence of someone who believed the world bent to his pace. "Mr. Ward," the man said smoothly, his voice low, cultivated, almost theatrical. "What a coincidence. I was told I might find you here. Gregory Harlow." He extended a manicured hand, his cufflinks winking gold as he did. Ethan accepted the handshake out of habit, though the touch was cool, the grip firm without callous. He studied the man's eyes, calm but calculating, the sort that measured not only worth, but weakness. Bruno stirred beneath the table, a soft growl vibrating like distant thunder. Ethan laid a boot against his side, steadying him without taking his eyes off Harlow. "You've got me at a disadvantage," Ethan said evenly. "Can't say I was expecting company." "No one expects opportunity," Harlow replied with a smile that showed too many teeth. "It simply arrives, and wise men know when to accept it." He slid into the booth opposite Ethan without waiting to be invited, the fabric of his tailored suit brushing against cracked vinyl. The waitress approached, but Harlow waved her off with a flick of his fingers, his attention fixed entirely on Ethan. "I'll be blunt," Harlow continued, leaning forward, his polished tone dropping lower. "The Shadow Ridge silver mine. It's fallen into your hands by fortune or folly, but I'm prepared to make you an offer for it. 500,000, cash, immediate." The number hung in the air like a spark thrown into dry grass, absurd in its scale. Ethan didn't flinch, though his stomach tightened. He thought of the rusted gate, the dark shaft, the fresh tracks pressed into earth. He thought of Bruno's growl. "That's a lot of money for a pile of rock and rust," Ethan said at last. Harlow's smile widened, though his eyes sharpened. "You underestimate the value of history, Mr. Ward. That property is more than land. It's legacy, and legacies should be preserved by those who understand their worth." Ethan sipped his coffee slowly, letting the silence do its work. Bruno's growl rumbled again, this time louder, the shepherd shifting under the table, teeth flashing briefly in the dim light. Harlow's gaze flicked downward and then back, but his expression never wavered. He simply adjusted his cufflink, smoothing his sleeve as if brushing away invisible dust. "You're a soldier," Harlow said after a pause, his voice soft now, carrying a strange intimacy. "You know better than most that some battles aren't worth fighting. Old wounds fester if left open. Sometimes the wisest course is to let them heal. Walk away." The words were dressed in civility, but Ethan heard the edge beneath them, the veiled threat stitched into silk. He leaned forward, setting his mug down with deliberate calm. "I didn't come here looking for a fight," he said, voice steady. "But I don't take kindly to being told where to stand." For the first time, Harlow's smile faltered, a hairline crack across polished stone. It returned just as quickly, but the faint twitch at the corner of his eye betrayed him. He straightened, smoothing his tie, and rose from the booth. "Well," he said, his tone once again light, rehearsed, "I can see you are a man of principle, admirable, perhaps foolish, but admirable." He slipped a card from his pocket, setting it gently on the table with 2 fingers. "My number. Call me when you come to your senses." He turned then, leaving the booth with the same unhurried confidence, leather shoes clicking against the linoleum as though the diner floor were marble. The bell over the door jingled again, and then he was gone, his presence lingering like smoke. Ethan stared at the card, white and stark, Gregory Harlow's name embossed in gold. Bruno pressed against his leg, a final growl fading into silence. Ethan slipped the card into his pocket, not as invitation but as evidence. It wasn't an offer. It was a warning. The town library was a squat brick building that looked as though it had been forgotten by the world, but kept alive by the stubbornness of a few volunteers. Ethan pushed open the heavy door, Bruno padding silently at his heel, and was met with the faint smell of old paper and lemon polish. A woman in her 70s looked up from behind the desk, glasses perched low on her nose, and offered a polite nod. Ethan gave one back, signed his name in the visitor's book without explanation, and moved to the archives section. He wasn't sure what he was looking for exactly, only that Gregory Harlow's polished warning had sharpened the itch already in his gut. The mine wasn't just another abandoned relic, and the world was too strange for $500,000 offers without cause. He spent hours threading through reels of microfilm, the machine humming quietly as grainy headlines flickered past his eyes. Dusty newspapers from the 1930s spoke of strikes and layoffs. The mine shuttered after a collapse that killed 7 men. But it was the early 1940s that made him lean closer. A headline dated 1942 declared in bold letters, "Government Requisition at Shadow Ridge." The article was brief, sterile, announcing that the War Department had seized the mine for national security purposes. No details given, just that the tunnels would remain closed to the public until further notice. Another report from 1943 mentioned soldiers stationed in the valley, trucks coming and going under cover of night, the road restricted by military order. The only phrase that repeated, once in a clipped column and again in an official notice, was Operation Aegis. No explanation, no context, just a name, capitalized as if it carried a weight readers were meant not to question. Ethan scribbled notes in the margin of a library pad, his handwriting tight and deliberate, the way he used to draft field reports. Each fact stacked against the next until the outline of something larger took shape. The government had wanted Shadow Ridge. Not its silver, at least not only that. They had wanted its tunnels, its isolation, its secrecy. And they had done something there that had been buried just as surely as the shafts themselves. By the time he left the library, the sky was turning copper at the edges, the autumn air sinking into his bones. He walked down Main Street to a tavern that sat beneath a flickering neon sign. The kind of place where locals ended their days and strangers were measured by silence. He ordered a beer and a sandwich, slid into a corner booth, and let Bruno settle at his feet. He had no plan to ask questions openly, but fate often moved quicker than intention. An old man at the bar, his face carved by years of wind and coal dust, shuffled over with a drink in hand. His back was bent, his hands blackened with age spots and permanent grime, but his eyes carried the clear light of memory. "You're Miller's boy," the man said, not as a question, but a certainty. "I saw you at the gate yesterday. Thought I'd never see another ward poke around that cursed hole." Ethan gestured for him to sit. The man did, lowering himself carefully into the booth, setting his glass down with a thud. "Name's Whitaker. I worked that mine before the government boys rolled in. Was just a kid then, but I remember." Ethan stayed quiet, letting the silence coax the words free. "They came in trucks," Whitaker said slowly, as if pulling the memories from stone. "Soldiers with rifles, engineers with clipboards, said it was for the war effort. Silver for bullets, they told us. But they didn't take ore out. Not the way we did. No, their trucks came at night, heavy, covered with canvas. Whatever they were carrying, it wasn't silver. They sealed shafts, bricked up whole tunnels we'd worked for years. We'd hear noises down there, metallic bangs echoing long after the work had stopped. Like the mountain itself was swallowing secrets." His voice dropped lower, rough as gravel. "One night I saw them hauling crates the size of coffins. No markings, no words, just stacked into the trucks and gone by dawn. When it ended, they welded doors shut, posted guards for a while, and then vanished. Left the place to rot. Never gave us answers." Ethan felt the words sink like stones into his chest. He thought of Harlow's offer, the tracks at the gate, the echo that had reached him through the canyon. He reached for his glass, swallowing the bitterness that rose in his throat. "You think it was weapons?" he asked. Whitaker shook his head. "Maybe. Or maybe something worse. A mine doesn't need rifles watching it if all it holds is ore. No, they hid something, left it buried when the war ended. Folks around here don't go near it now. Too many ghosts." His eyes found Ethan's, sharp despite their age. "If it's yours now, boy, best let it stay buried." Bruno shifted under the table, a low huff breaking the pause, his head pressing gently against Ethan's knee, as if reminding him he wasn't alone. Ethan set a hand on the shepherd's head, grounding himself. Whitaker drained his glass, stood with a slow scrape of boots, and left without another word, the neon buzzing overhead as the door swung closed. Ethan sat in the quiet booth, staring at the condensation on his glass, the fragments of history stitching themselves into a pattern he couldn't ignore. A government operation, sealed tunnels, crates moved under darkness, and now an inheritance falling into his hands like a map folded across decades. He had spent years trying to walk away from missions, from duties that chained him to ghosts, but the truth pressed against him now with the weight of inevitability. His uncle had left him the mine for a reason. Chance had nothing to do with it. The mountain air was sharper the next morning, brittle with frost that laced the grass along the track to the mine. Ethan drove in silence, the truck rattling over ruts, his thoughts wound tight around the words he had read, the stories Whitaker had told, the name that haunted the archives, Operation Aegis. Bruno sat upright in the passenger seat, head forward, every line of his body humming with alertness, as if he too understood they were no longer approaching a ruin, but entering contested ground. When the truck rolled to a stop before the rusted gate, Ethan shut off the engine and let the silence settle. No birdsong, no wind, just the yawning shaft ahead like an open throat ready to swallow. He pulled a flashlight from the glove box, checked the batteries, then slung a canvas pack over his shoulder. Inside were only essentials, Water, rope, a pry bar, a folding shovel, and extra batteries. Bruno padded at his side, nails clicking lightly against the stone. They slipped through the sagging gate, stepping into the mine's mouth, the darkness swallowing them whole. The beam of the flashlight cut a narrow cone through dust thick as smoke. Rotted beams framed the tunnel, their wood black with age, dripping with moisture that ran in rivulets down the stone walls. The smell was sharp, metallic, like iron mixed with mold. Ethan's boots sank into damp earth, every step echoing too long, each sound bouncing back as though the mountain itself were listening. Bruno moved ahead, but not far, tail low, ears pricked, his paws cautious on the uneven ground. Ethan swept the light along the walls, finding old tool marks, rusted rails where carts once carried ore, and cables that hung like cobwebs from the ceiling. Time had reduced industry to bones. Deeper they went, past chambers that had collapsed, piles of rubble spilling like frozen waves across the floor. Water dripped in steady beats from overhead, each drop magnified in the silence. They rounded a bend where the air grew colder, carrying a stillness that pressed heavier on Ethan's chest. Bruno froze, nose twitching, then stepped toward a section where rubble blocked half the passage. The dog sniffed at the stones, then pawed at the pile, claws scraping sharp against rock. His whine was urgent, high, and insistent. Ethan set down the pack, aimed the flashlight, and saw what the dog had found. Beneath the tumbled stone and rotted timbers was metal, not rusted rails but a surface, flat and smooth, dull gray beneath the dust. Ethan crouched, brushing debris away with his hands. The beam revealed more. A door of steel set into the mountain wall, half buried by collapse. Its surface was thick, seamless, edges fitted with precision far beyond the mine's crude construction. In its center, faint but undeniable, was an engraving. An 8-spoked mining wheel, each spoke etched deep, the lines clean despite the decades. The symbol caught the light like a compass, or a sun frozen in iron. Bruno barked once, sharp, then pawed harder at the seam. Ethan pressed his palm against the cold surface. It was unyielding, solid as the mountain itself. He tapped with his knuckles. Sound came back muted, not the hollow of a simple wall, but the heavy silence of something sealed. He ran the flashlight along the perimeter, tracing where stone met steel, and saw no handle, no lock, no keyhole. Just a perfect plate, closed with purpose. This wasn't sealed against thieves, Ethan murmured, voice low, reverberating off the damp stone. It was sealed against time. The words hung in the cavern, swallowed by darkness. He thought of Whitaker's story. Soldiers bricking shafts, crates moved at night, doors welded shut. He thought of Harlow, offering money far beyond reason. And he thought of his uncle, the quiet academic who had chosen him of all people to inherit this burden. It was no accident. This door was the reason. Bruno whined again, nose pressed to the seam, nails scratching as though urging him to understand. Ethan pulled back, studying the wheel engraved in the center. 8 spokes radiated outward like the arms of fate. It wasn't decoration. It was a mark, maybe a code, maybe a lock waiting for the right hand. His military training whispered caution. A sealed door in hostile ground was never to be forced blindly. You probed, you observed, you waited. He packed the debris back loosely, covering the edges to leave no obvious sign. The mountain had hidden this secret for decades. It could wait another day while he gathered strength. Bruno resisted, growling low, eyes bright with the urgency of instinct. Ethan rested a hand on his neck. Easy, boy, I hear it too, but we're not ready. They retraced their steps through the dripping tunnels, each echo heavier than the last. At the shaft's mouth, Ethan turned, shining the light one last time into the depths. The beam vanished into black, swallowed whole by the mountain. The 8-spoked wheel burned in his mind, as though he could still see it even when he shut his eyes. Outside, the air hit like a wave, crisp and filled with pine. He pulled the gate shut behind them, though the rusted chain rattled weakly, a mockery of defense. Bruno sat at his side, gaze fixed back toward the mine, chest rising and falling in steady beats. Ethan leaned against the truck, his thoughts circling like vultures. He had inherited a fortress, not a ruin. A vault buried by soldiers, guarded by silence, branded with a symbol that meant something to someone still alive. He whispered to himself, almost a vow. If it's locked, it can be opened. And if it's sealed, there's a reason why. Bruno lifted his head, ears pricked, tail giving one slow, deliberate thump against the earth. The mountain had spoken again. Ethan knew now he would have to listen. Night had settled heavy over the cabin when Ethan spread the contents of his uncle's old trunk across the scarred wooden table. The single lamp threw a circle of yellow light over ledgers, notebooks, and scraps of loose paper that smelled faintly of mildew and smoke. Bruno lay curled near the fire, eyes half-lidded but ears flicking each time Ethan shifted a page. Most of the notes were mundane. Land deeds, tax records, family correspondence written in neat but impersonal script. Yet one battered ledger stood out. Its leather binding was cracked, the corners worn soft by decades of use, and between lists of expenses and shipments were sketches, odd and out of place. Ethan leaned closer, heart kicking against his ribs. There, drawn in the margin, was the 8-spoked wheel. The same engraving burned into the steel door beneath the collapsed chamber. His uncle's hand had rendered it in precise lines, annotated with arrows and faint numbers, degrees, coordinates, rotations. Ethan traced the pencil marks with a calloused finger, studying the way each spoke was paired with numbers written like notches on a compass. It wasn't ornament. It wasn't even symbolic. It was mechanical. His uncle had known. He flipped further and found more. On one page, a line read, "Wheel as lock, not as seal. Motion, not mass." Beneath it, another scrawl, "Foundation date, 1876. 3 turns. Sequences birth, collapse, rebirth." Ethan sat back, the words echoing in his skull. 1876 was the year the Shadow Ridge Mine had been founded, a fact he'd read in the library archives. Collapse, he knew, referred to the disaster that had claimed lives in 1935. Rebirth, perhaps the government's seizure in 1942. 3 turns, 3 points in history. He shut the ledger, mind sharpening in the way it once had before patrols, when every detail mattered, when the smallest clue meant the difference between life and death. His uncle had not left the mine to him by mistake. He had left him a puzzle. The next morning dawned cold and gray, the mountains wrapped in mist that clung to the pines. Ethan and Bruno returned to the mine, the gate moaning as they pushed through. Inside, the air grew danker, carrying the same metallic tang, but this time Ethan's steps were surer, driven by something more than curiosity. At the collapsed chamber, he set the flashlight beam against the steel door, its 8-spoked wheel gleaming faintly beneath centuries of grime. Bruno paced, restless, whining at the edges as if urging him forward. Ethan brushed away the dust with his sleeve, the engraved spokes emerging sharp and deliberate. He studied the center, running fingers over grooves almost invisible, and felt a catch beneath his palm, a seam where the wheel met the steel. He pressed. It shifted, barely perceptible, but real. The wheel rotated. His breath froze in his throat. It was a lock disguised as a symbol, just as his uncle had written. Bruno barked once, the sound harsh in the closed air. Ethan steadied himself, gripped the wheel, and began the first turn. The numbers in his head lined up with the dates. 1876. He twisted slowly, aligning the first spoke with the etched mark at the edge of the plate. The wheel ground faintly, a sound like stone teeth scraping. He adjusted, heart pounding, the cold sweat on his temple mixing with dust. Second turn, 1935. Collapse. He rotated counterclockwise, hands firm despite the tremor in his muscles. Bruno whined again, tail stiff, eyes locked on him as though sharing the weight of the moment. The wheel resisted, then clicked softly into place, vibrations echoing through the steel. Third turn, 1942. Rebirth or seizure. Operation Aegis. Ethan rotated clockwise, slow and deliberate, every second stretching like a mile. His fingers ached, but the wheel moved, protesting with the groan of metal that had not been touched in decades. When he aligned it, the chamber fell into silence so complete he could hear his own pulse. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then came the sound. A deep, grinding rumble that vibrated through the floor, sending dust sifting from the ceiling. Bruno barked sharply, backing a step, then lunged forward again, nose pressed toward the seam. The wheel turned of its own accord now, shifting a fraction, before locking into place with a heavy final clunk. Ethan stepped back as the steel door shuddered, then split along hidden seams. A hiss of stale air exhaled into the chamber, damp and bitter, carrying the smell of stone sealed too long. The door ground open slowly, metal scraping against rock, revealing a shaft cut deeper into the mountain, its walls smooth, reinforced not by miners but by engineers. A black throat descending into silence. Ethan's chest tightened, not with fear but with something older, sharper, the raw edge of purpose. For years he had drifted, a soldier without a war, a man who sought only to disappear into the wilderness. But standing before that shaft, the taste of iron in the air, the wheel still vibrating faintly from its release, he felt the old clarity return. Mission, objective, unknown enemy, unknown prize. His breath steadied, his shoulders squared. He was back in the field, not because he wanted to be, but because fate had dragged him there. Bruno pressed against his leg, ears perked, muscles coiled. The shepherd's amber eyes met his, steady, fearless. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's head, fingers brushing through the thick fur. "You were right," he whispered. "There's something here." He aimed the flashlight into the newly opened shaft. The beam was swallowed quickly, but stone steps could be seen spiraling down, precise and deliberate, carved not by miners but by careful hands with a plan. This was no ordinary tunnel. This was a vault. Ethan adjusted the pack on his shoulders, the weight suddenly feeling lighter. He could hear the grind of his own voice as he spoke aloud, words half a vow, half a revelation. "This isn't just an inheritance, it's a mission." The echo carried down the shaft like the mountain itself had answered. Bruno's bark followed, sharp and sure. Together they stood at the threshold of something hidden by war, buried by time, and guarded by silence. Ethan drew one last steadying breath, the fire of purpose kindling again in his chest, and stepped closer to the darkness that awaited. The shaft swallowed them step by step, each bootfall echoing against stone cut too clean to belong to miners' hands. The spiral stairs descended in tight circles, slick with condensation, the air growing colder with every turn. Bruno moved close, his paws sure, his breath steady, his eyes never leaving the shadows below. Ethan kept the flashlight angled down, its narrow beam cutting through stale air that smelled of metal and damp earth sealed away for half a century. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a chamber, square and deliberate, its walls reinforced with riveted steel panels and its ceiling arched like the inside of a vault. Dust lay thick over the floor, but the order of the place had not been undone. It was no ruin. It was storage. Ethan swept the light across the room and saw them. Crates stacked in neat rows, their stenciled markings faded but still legible. Aegis. Steel boxes sat bolted shut, corners welded, lids cross-braced with rivets. Along one wall rested chests reinforced with iron bands, each stamped with the same word and a number beneath. This was not a mine shaft. It was a warehouse carved from the mountain. Bruno moved ahead, nose brushing against the wooden edges of the crates, then pawing lightly at one chest, as if to draw Ethan's attention. Ethan crouched, brushing away dust until the stencils came clear. Operation Aegis, property of the United States War Department. He pried open a crate with the edge of his folding shovel, the wood splintering reluctantly after decades of silence. Inside were not silver ingots or ore samples, but bundles of documents sealed in waxed canvas, labels typed in faded ink. He drew one out carefully, the paper crackling with age. Across the top, in red block letters, classified. Beneath that, strategic material, restricted access. Ethan's throat tightened. These weren't mining records. They were government files, the sort whispered about but never meant to be seen again. Another box yielded sealed cylinders, dull metal canisters the size of artillery shells, their surfaces marked with caution symbols. Ethan recognized the signs: radioactive materials, rare ores pulled from veins no one had spoken of. Whatever Aegis had been, it wasn't about silver. It was about something that made governments nervous and men like Harlow greedy. Bruno whined low, his paw pressing against the side of a different chest, this one heavier, iron-banded, the lock rusted but intact. Ethan knelt and forced it with the pry bar, the screech of metal loud in the cavern. Inside lay no files, no canisters, just a leather folio wrapped in oilcloth. His hands shook as he peeled it open. Within was a letter, its ink faded but the handwriting sharp, deliberate. Ethan read aloud in a voice that trembled with disbelief. To whom it may concern, I, Thomas Ward, refuse the directive to release the secured materials into the custody of Mr. Alistair Harlow or his agents. The claims of ownership presented are forgeries, crafted to disguise theft from families destroyed by this war. To surrender to such deception would be to dishonor not only the law but the dead. I have therefore locked the contents within Shadow Ridge until rightful claimants can be traced, or until men of honor stand guard over them. The words blurred as Ethan's grip tightened, the paper crinkling in his fist. His ancestor had defied the Harlow dynasty at the close of the war, sealing this vault not for profit, but for principle. And the Harlow family, unable to erase the truth, had spent generations trying to claw it back. Gregory Harlow's smooth offer in the diner, the veiled threat beneath his smile. It was not about land or silver. It was about silence, about burying a history that exposed their fortune as built on lies. Ethan leaned back on his heels, the letter trembling in his hand. His uncle had known this history. That was why the mine had not been sold, why it had been left to Ethan. Not because he needed a place, but because he was a soldier, a man bound by oaths stronger than greed. The inheritance was no gift. It was a charge. Bruno pressed against his shoulder, his head heavy, eyes locked on the letter as if he too felt the gravity of the moment. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the truth pressing against him harder than the mountain above. This was not treasure. It was testimony. Proof carved in paper and iron that the Harlow dynasty had profited from blood and forgery. He folded the letter carefully, sliding it into his jacket. His grip lingered on the pocket as though he were securing a weapon. In a way, he was. Knowledge sharper than any blade, more dangerous than any gun. He swept the beam of the flashlight across the room again, over the crates, the sealed boxes, the hidden history entombed here. His soldier's instincts surged. Not fear, but the clarity of purpose. He understood the stakes. He understood the enemy. "This isn't silver," Ethan said softly, his voice carrying across the steel walls. "This is truth." Bruno gave a single sharp bark, as if affirming the vow. In that echoing chamber, Ethan felt the shift inside himself, the transition from reluctant heir to chosen guardian. His solitude was gone. His peace was broken. But his mission, at last, had returned. The letter from Thomas Ward weighed in Ethan's jacket pocket like iron, its words etched deeper into him with every breath. The crates, the canisters, the sealed files, all of it could wait. But the truth could not. He returned to the cabin with Bruno at his side, the shepherd's pace steady and silent, as though he knew their world had shifted. Inside, Ethan laid the files he had taken on the table, spread them out in neat order, and set to work. He photographed every page with calm precision, his hands steady despite the storm in his chest. The digital copies uploaded into an encrypted cloud service he still maintained from his service days, a lifeline once used for field reports. Now it was insurance. The originals went back into a waterproof satchel. Evidence was ammunition, and a soldier never left his ammunition exposed. When the files were secured, he pulled the phone from his pocket and scrolled to a number he hadn't used in years. Sarah Lynn, former squadmate, sharp-eyed and relentless, who had traded fatigues for suits. The battlefield for the FBI's Art and Heritage Crime Division. He hesitated for a breath, then pressed call. It rang twice before her voice answered, low and clipped, the way it had always been. "Ward," she said. "It's been a while." "Too long," Ethan replied, his voice rough with dust and memory. "I found something that's going to matter." There was silence on the other end, then the rustle of papers, the tone of a woman who had learned not to waste words. "Talk." He told her enough. The mine, the sealed vault, Operation Aegis, the letter from his ancestor. Not the full scope, not the location, not yet. Trust had never been a question between them, but exposure was a risk he couldn't afford. "You understand what you're holding?" Sarah said after he finished. "I do," Ethan replied, "and I'm not selling. Not to Harlow, not to anyone. I'll guard it until the truth can stand on its own." A breath came across the line, steady but tense. "Then you'd better prepare, because if Harlow made his move once, he'll make it again, and he won't stop with polite offers." "I know," Ethan said simply. "That's why I called you. When the time comes, I'll need a hand from someone who remembers what we swore to protect. Until then, it's my post." There was a pause, then her voice softened, just for a moment. "You always did take the worst assignments." "And you always covered my 6, Ethan said. "I still do," Sarah replied. Then the line clicked dead. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried purpose, weight, resolve. Ethan slipped the phone into his pocket, turned to Bruno and nodded. "Looks like it's just us again, partner." From that moment, the mine was no longer a relic. It was a fortress to be prepared. Ethan spent the next days reinforcing its entrance. He strung thin wires low across the clearing, attached to stacks of tin cans that would rattle with the slightest touch. He wedged logs into narrow passages, forcing bottlenecks that could be held if pressed. He dragged debris across the old road, forcing any vehicle to slow, giving himself precious seconds. Each task was deliberate, each measure pulled from memory of faraway patrols where survival was measured in minutes and warning came only in sound and instinct. Bruno was with him every step, moving ahead to sniff the air, circling back to watch his master's work, lying silently at the shaft when Ethan paused. When Ethan tested the alarms, rattling the cans with his boot, Bruno barked sharply, tail stiff, as if approving. When Ethan shifted heavy stones to block the old cart track, Bruno strained against the weight beside him, muscles bunching, claws scraping earth. They worked as they always had, two soldiers bound not by orders but by loyalty. At night, Ethan lay awake in the cabin, listening to the forest. Every creak of timber, every sigh of wind pressed sharper now. Bruno slept near the door, his ears never still, his breath steady but alert. Ethan would rise sometimes, step to the window, and stare toward the mountain where the vault slept beneath steel and stone. He knew Harlow would come again, and when he did, the mine would not be undefended. The vow he had made was simple. He would not surrender the secret. He would guard it as his ancestor had, until the truth could be carried into the light. It was no longer about inheritance. It was no longer about peace. It was about duty, the kind that bound bloodlines across generations, the kind that did not fade when uniforms were folded away. He sat by the fire one night, Bruno's head resting heavy against his boot, and whispered aloud, though there was no one to hear but the dog and the mountain. This is our post now. Until the truth is safe, we hold. Bruno stirred, lifting his head, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. He gave a single low bark, a sound not of warning but of agreement, of promise. Ethan reached down, running his fingers through the thick fur at his neck. The shepherd leaned into the touch, solid, steady, unbreakable. The soldier in Ethan had not died. He had only been waiting. Now, with Bruno beside him, and the mountain guarding its secrets, the mission was clear. The storm came down the ridge like a living thing, black clouds clawing over the peaks, rain driving against the cabin roof in hard, slanted sheets. Thunder rolled so deep it rattled the boards, but beneath the natural violence of the night, Ethan heard something else, softer, deliberate, the crunch of boots on wet earth. Bruno rose before he spoke, hackles sharp, a low growl vibrating like the strike of a drum. Ethan moved quickly, gathering his flashlight, sidearm, and the pack already prepared. The mine was their target. It had always been. They slipped into the darkness together, rain soaking through Ethan's flannel as he crossed the clearing, Bruno pressed tight at his side. At the mouth of the shaft, the shepherd froze, ears pricked, eyes locked, his growl deepening. Ethan crouched low, his palm on the dog's neck, and peered into the black. 4 shadows slipped through the gate, their forms cut into the storm by brief flashes of lightning. They moved with precision, not townsmen, but soldiers for hire, rifles cradled, eyes scanning. Behind them came a 5th figure, steady despite the slick mud, his umbrella discarded, his suit glistening under the rain. Gregory Harlow. Ethan whispered, "It's time." And Bruno shifted like a coiled spring. The mercenaries advanced into the shaft, their beams cutting through dust and dripping stone. Ethan guided Bruno deeper into the tunnels, every step mapped in his mind from days of preparation. He had strung wire at the low passages, cans ready to clatter, beams loosened to collapse at the touch. The first alarm rattled as a boot struck the wire, tin cans clanging in sharp defiance. The men swore, beams of light jerking, and Ethan smiled grimly. They would not own the silence tonight. Bruno darted ahead, his bark splitting the air, bouncing down the stone corridors like a ghostly chorus. The intruders halted, their beams sweeping wildly. Echoes turned footsteps into confusion, every sound doubled and tripled, the mountain itself joining the fight. Ethan pulled a rope where he had wedged a rotten beam. It crashed down with a deafening roar, spraying dust so thick it blinded the men. Their shouts carried, muffled, panicked. Through the haze, Ethan moved like a shadow, his flashlight snapping on, then off, always from a different angle. One mercenary fired blind into the dust, bullets whining off stone. Bruno lunged past him, his bark cracking sharp, a diversion that sent the man stumbling toward another snare. A weighted log swung down from the ceiling, slamming into his shoulder, throwing him against the wall. The others regrouped, their training tightening formation. They pushed deeper toward the chamber. Ethan fell back, using each turn of the tunnels to delay them. He loosened piles of rubble with his boot, sending cascades of stone across their path. He shattered lantern glass with a thrown rock, leaving sections in darkness. Bruno's growls and sharp movements made them fire at shadows. Their bullets wasted against walls that gave back nothing but echoes. At last they reached the vault chamber, its steel door looming in the beam of their lights, the eight-spoked wheel gleaming faintly through the dust. Harlow stepped forward, his smile carved into calm even as his men panted. He spoke loud enough for the chamber to carry. "Ward, enough of these games. You're a soldier. You know futility when you see it. This is mine, by right, and no dog or ghost will keep me from it." Ethan emerged from the side tunnel. Bruno pressed close, both of them silhouettes in the flicker of lightning that reached through cracks in the rock. His voice carried steady, sharper than the storm. "It's not silver you want. It's silence. But this vault doesn't belong to you, and the truth won't be buried again." Harlow's eyes flashed, cold fury beneath the mask. He gestured and his men raised rifles, the standoff locking tight, 5 barrels aimed at one man and his dog. Bruno's growl was low, endless, vibrating through stone. Ethan steadied his breath, finger grazing the trigger of his sidearm, mind already mapping the first move, the second, the sacrifice if needed. Then the night split with a new sound. Sirens, distant at first, then swelling, their wail carried down the canyon like the voice of judgment. Floodlights cut through the storm outside, beams slashing against the cliff face, shadows scattering as vehicles skidded into the clearing. A voice, amplified and commanding, thundered through the tunnels. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, drop your weapons and come out with your hands up." The mercenaries froze, torn between orders and instinct. Harlow's smile faltered, his jaw tightening as the truth settled. Ethan did not lower his weapon, but his voice was iron. "You wanted to bury this, Harlow, but the mountain speaks, and now so will the law." The chamber filled with the wail of sirens echoing down the shaft, with the clash of men who had thought themselves hunters, now realizing they were trapped prey. Bruno stood steady at Ethan's side, every line of his body ready. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the burden of silence lift, replaced by something older, purer, the weight of a vow kept, the clarity of a soldier holding his ground until reinforcements arrived. The vault loomed behind him, sealed and waiting, but the night's battle was already decided. The storm outside was nothing compared to the reckoning inside. The tunnels blazed with sudden light as tactical beams cut through the dust, boots pounding in synchronized rhythm, voices sharp with command. Bruno barked once, not in warning but recognition, and Ethan stepped back as figures in FBI jackets surged into the chamber. Sarah Lynn was at the front, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes narrowed with the same unwavering focus Ethan remembered from deserts halfway across the world. She moved with efficiency, her sidearms steady, her team flanking to cover every angle. In seconds, the mercenaries were forced to their knees, rifles kicked away, hands bound with zip ties. Harlow stood rigid, his expensive suit torn and dust-stained, his mask of civility cracked. He tried a final smirk, but it wavered under Sarah's command. "Gregory Harlow," she said coldly, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice." Her voice echoed against steel and stone, stripping him of the last veneer of control. Harlow's men muttered curses as they were dragged back toward the surface, their boots scraping on stone, the sound of shackles cutting through the chamber. Harlow himself struggled, spitting words of denial. But Sarah silenced him with the recitation of his rights, her tone clipped and final. Ethan stood still through it all, Bruno pressed firm against his leg, the shepherd's steady breath anchoring him in the moment. The vault loomed behind them, its secrets untouched but no longer in danger of being stolen. When the noise settled, Sarah crossed to Ethan. Her gaze softened a fraction, though her stance remained sharp. "You did well," she said, almost an acknowledgement, almost a warning. Ethan handed her the waterproof satchel, the documents he had photographed and secured. She flipped through the pages, her eyes flicking quick, recognition dawning as the scope of corruption unraveled. Decades of fraud, false claims, political bribes, all tied back to the Harlow dynasty and their attempt to bury Operation Aegis. "This is enough to bring their empire down," she murmured. Ethan nodded, his expression calm, almost detached. "It's not silver in that vault, it's the truth. That's what he was afraid of." His voice was steady, not the strained rasp of a haunted man, but the calm report of a soldier who had completed an assignment. Sarah looked at him closely, as if weighing the changes etched into the lines of his face, then nodded once in silent respect. The team began cataloging, photographing, sealing evidence. Cameras flashed, crates were tagged, files placed into protective cases. The chamber that had once been silent now throbbed with order and justice, the hum of purpose filling every shadow. Ethan gave his statement in clipped sentences, his tone level, every word measured. He explained the letter from Thomas Ward, the vault's mechanism, Harlow's approach, the attack. His account was thorough but not embellished, the habit of years in uniform where reports carried life and death. He spoke as though the ghosts that had weighed on him were no longer pressing so heavily against his ribs. Bruno sat beside him the entire time, still and vigilant, his amber eyes sweeping the chamber, his ears flicking at every noise. Agents passed by, some with faint smiles at the shepherd's composure, others whispering how he seemed more soldier than dog. Ethan rested a hand on his partner's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath the fur, drawing strength from that simple constancy. When the last statement was signed, when the evidence was secured and the prisoners hauled up the spiraling stairs, Ethan lingered at the chamber's edge. The vault loomed behind him, still heavy with secrets yet to be unpacked. But for now it was safe, protected under the law. He closed his eyes and listened. No gunfire, no shouted orders, no screams echoing through memory. Just the quiet drip of water, the faint hum of equipment, the steady breath of his dog. For the first time in years, the nightmares that had clawed at his sleep seemed to loosen their grip. The familiar edge of panic, the jolts awake drenched in sweat, the endless cycle of reliving battles long past, they receded into the shadows. In their place came something unfamiliar, almost fragile. Peace. Not the peace of isolation, but the peace of purpose fulfilled. He realized the mission had given him back what the wars had stolen, the clarity of knowing why he endured and who he protected. Sarah's voice cut softly through his thoughts. "You'll be debriefed. You'll be needed again. But not as a soldier, Ethan. As a guardian." He looked at her, then down at Bruno, who tilted his head as though understanding every word. A faint smile touched Ethan's lips, the first in a long time. "I've already got my partner." They walked together toward the stairs, the storm outside easing into steady rain, the thunder fading into distance. Floodlights washed the clearing, agents moving with controlled efficiency, the mercenaries already loaded into vehicles. Harlow glared from the back of a transport, but his eyes no longer carried threat. They carried defeat. Ethan stood beneath the rain, Bruno at his side, watching as the convoy pulled away. He breathed deep, the scent of wet pine and stone filling his chest. For once it wasn't a weight. It was air, clean and grounding. He reached down, resting his hand on Bruno's head, and whispered, "Mission complete." Bruno pressed against his leg, tail giving a single deliberate thump in answer. Morning broke slow over the mountains, soft light peeling back the last of the storm. The ridge gleamed wet and clean, its pines glistening with rain, its cliffs washed bare as if the night's fury had been a baptism. At Shadow Ridge, the vault no longer felt like a grave. It had been catalogued, its files and ore sealed into protective cases, its crates stamped and marked for transport. Trucks rolled away under federal escort, bound not for markets or black ledgers, but for national archives, where truth would be stored, studied, and preserved. No longer whispers in the dark, no longer secrets twisted for power. The mountain had spoken, and this time its voice would endure. Ethan stood at the gate with Bruno pressed close against his leg, watching as the convoy dwindled into distance. He felt no loss. The ore, the classified files, even the letter from Thomas Ward. All of it belonged not to him, but to history. He had been a guardian until it was safe to hand them over, and in that he found no bitterness, only a quiet pride. What remained was the land, the mine, and the chance to shape something better from a place once scarred by silence. The government, grateful but bound by its own policies, offered compensation, restitution for the decades the Ward family had carried a burden in secret. Ethan accepted, but not for himself. He used the funds to rebuild Shadow Ridge, not as a mine, not as a vault, but as a sanctuary. Slowly, with the help of locals who had once eyed him warily, the broken cabins were repaired, the rusted gate restored, and the old offices converted into a community hall. A flag was raised at the entrance, not of a corporation, but of memory. A plaque was set in stone at the gate, Shadow Ridge Veterans and History Center. It began with a handful of men and women, former soldiers like him, searching for footing in the quiet after battle. They came with haunted eyes, with scars that didn't always show on their skin, with stories that needed listening but not judgment. Ethan welcomed them with coffee, with steady silence, with the reminder that a mission could still exist after uniforms were folded away. Soon children from town visited too, their laughter chasing echoes out of the shafts, their wide eyes listening to lessons about sacrifice, truth, and how even mountains can keep secrets for decades. The town changed with him. Where once locals had whispered about the soldier in the cabin and his growling shepherd, they now nodded in respect when he passed. They saw him not as a man hiding from war, but as someone who had given back something greater than gold. Trust. Old miners who had sworn never to walk near the ridge again came to sit on benches at the restored clearing, telling stories to young ears, their voices weaving history into something brighter. Bruno aged through those years, his muzzle silvering, his gait slowing, but his spirit never dimming. He claimed the gate as his post, lying there each day with the calm, dignity of a sentinel. Children would pat his head, and he would thump his tail, but his eyes always scanned the horizon, as though remembering nights when shadows crept with menace. To Ethan, Bruno was not just a companion, but a living monument, a guardian of both memory and truth. One autumn evening, as the sun bled orange across the cliffs and the air smelled of pine and smoke from distant chimneys, Ethan sat on the steps of the community hall. Bruno lay beside him, head heavy on his boot, chest rising slow with age. The sound of voices drifted from inside. Veterans sharing stories, children asking questions, Sarah giving a lecture about the recovered files of Operation Aegis. Ethan closed his eyes and listened, not to echoes of gunfire or the nightmares that had once stalked his sleep, but to the hum of life rebuilt. The ghosts were quieter now. Not gone, never gone, but at peace. He reached down, scratching gently behind Bruno's ears. "We did it, partner," he whispered. The shepherd's tail moved once, slow, deliberate, as though agreeing. The mine had once been a wound, scarred by war, greed, and lies. Now it was a place of learning, of healing, of remembering without fear. Where crates of secrets had been hidden, now stood walls lined with photographs and letters. Where mercenaries had once stalked in shadows, now veterans walked in daylight, guiding children through history. The transformation was not in stone or steel, but in purpose. Ethan rose, his knees stiff but his step steady, and looked out at the ridge one last time as the evening settled. The sun dropped low, casting long shadows across the gate where Bruno lay like an old sentinel carved in living fur. The world had chased him into solitude, but the mountain had given him back to himself. In silence, he found purpose. In danger, he found clarity. In truth, he found peace. The treasure had never been silver. It had been the loyalty of a dog who never left his side, the legacy of ancestors who chose honor over greed, and the healing that came when truth was pulled from the dark and laid bare in the light. That was what Shadow Ridge had given him. That was what he would leave behind. Ethan stepped inside the hall, voices rising to meet him, and for the first time in many years, he felt not like a soldier without a war, but a guardian at peace with his post. The true treasure was never silver. It was truth, loyalty, and the healing born from both. In the end, Shadow Ridge did not surrender silver, but something far greater. It revealed truth buried in silence, loyalty that endured through storms, and healing born from sacrifice. And perhaps in that revelation, we see a glimpse of God's own hand, a reminder that miracles are not always thunder and lightning, but the quiet unveiling of what was hidden, the steady loyalty of a faithful friend, the courage to choose truth when lies are easier. In our own lives, we all carry hidden chambers, memories we'd rather seal, burdens we think we must face alone. Yet God shows us, through love, loyalty, and faith, that no darkness is stronger than light, no silence deeper than His presence. If this story touched your heart, share it so that others may feel its truth. Leave a comment to tell us where you are watching from, so this circle of faith and hope may grow wider. And if you believe that loyalty, truth, and God's grace still shape the world, subscribe to this channel and walk with us through more journeys of courage and redemption. May the Lord bless you, guard your home, and place faithful companions, whether people or animals, beside you always.